to today's Policy Forum hosted by the Raven Group. I'm Tim Lynch, a principal here at the Raven Group, and your moderator for today's policy event. And today's policy event is on the critical issue of oversight in today's political environment. And this is a topic that's near and dear to me. Before coming to the Raven Group, I had the honor and privilege of serving on the House Oversight Committee under the late great chairman, Elijah Cummings, and saw firsthand how important oversight can be in ensuring that our government is working for all the people. And today's topic couldn't be more timely. President Trump's unprecedented refusal to submit to any oversight and his commingling of his financial and political interests present persistent challenges to the country's tradition of how government works. This on top of his recent pledge of "I'll be the oversight" over billions of COVID-19 relief funds make it clear that every day we face serious threats to the public's ability to hold our leaders accountable. So we've got an all-star lineup of leading experts in oversight here today to help us talk through the issue. Our first guest, Noah Bookbinder.
Good to be here.
The executive director of the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, also known shorthand for CREW. Welcome. Our second guest, Molly Claflin.
Hi, thank you.
Hi. Molly's Chief Oversight Counsel at American Oversight. And last but certainly not least, we have Elizabeth Windra, the president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. So I want to extend a warm welcome on behalf of everyone who's tuning in virtually. So let's get started. So my first question is to all our guests. When it comes to oversight and the Trump administration, there's so much going on that even the most seasoned experts in oversight have trouble keeping up, let alone the public. So, when you look at the landscape of oversight issues involving this president, what's at the top of your list? I mean, it's hard to keep up. So why don't we start with you, Elizabeth?
Yeah, so that's a great question because, I think some of us feel overwhelmed. And I think it's easy to think about the basics here. When you feel overwhelmed, go back to the basics. And here I'd stick with Schoolhouse Rock. Checks and balances. That's what oversight is really. And, I think looking at the structural ways in which the Trump administration is challenging checks and balances, challenging oversight, whether it's trying to block congressional subpoenas, as we've seen across the board, and is currently playing out through some of the court cases, or whether it's trying to aid voter suppression, the ultimate oversight from we the people. Looking at these big picture checks and balances, I think is a good way at least to start off thinking about how we need to look at the Trump administration's obstruction of oversight.
That's great. Noah.
So building on what Elizabeth said, I think that what we have happening in this moment is that the president has already spent 3 years now undercutting oversight from Congress, undercutting oversight from the courts. And I think that one of the big stories of the last month or two when we've been in this crisis is his sort of next step in undercutting independent oversight, which has been going after the oversight mechanisms within the executive branch, particularly inspectors general, who are the independent watchdogs who are supposed to monitor what executive agencies do and sound the alarm when there are abuses. And the president signaled a few weeks back when he announced on a Friday night that he was firing the Inspector General for the Intelligence Community, who is the person who had notified Congress about the whistleblower complaint that led to his impeachment. And on the same night, announced that he was going to be appointing a loyalist to to one of the key oversight positions over the $2 trillion stimulus, what he essentially was showing to us is that he is trying to stifle any form of independent oversight and create a government that essentially answers to him and does not challenge him. And that really, really is dangerous to our system of checks and balances.
Thank you. Molly.
Well, I absolutely agree with what both Elizabeth and Noah have said in terms of Donald Trump showing us that he wants no oversight, and he doesn't believe in legitimate oversight. And that's been very clear, whether it's legitimate oversight from within his agencies, like the Inspector Generals, legitimate oversight from the co-equal branch of government, which is Congress, or legitimate oversight from the outside, which is the work that we all do, or from the press. And we've heard time and time again that any criticism of Donald Trump in the press, he immediately discards as fake. And so I think that the general assumption that there is no oversight is really, really scary in this administration. But to build on that, I think another one of the big issues that I've been watching throughout this administration is what's it going to do for Donald Trump? And I think throughout everything he's done, the policies he's done, the oversight he's quelled, all of these different aspects come down to Donald Trump working for Donald Trump instead of for the American people. And I think in every aspect of his policies, we've seen instances of this over and over and over again. And so anytime I see something coming out of this administration, my first question is, what is he getting out of this? Because there's always an answer.
That's a good point. It's great. So obviously the big issue the country's facing, we all feel it, COVID-19. So let's talk about oversight in this environment. Molly, your organization, American Oversight, has been doing a lot of work investigating the administration's response to this pandemic. And, one of the main Republican talking points we've seen emerging is that impeachment is to blame for distracting the president and the country from adequately preparing for COVID-19. What do you say to that?
Well, first, I would say that the president didn't seem particularly interested in the impeachment at the time either. As you recall, he didn't testify, he didn't turn over documents. So I don't know what was taking up most of his time, if that was the concern. But broadly, I think, this is true that the COVID response is really, really problematic and something that we want to make sure we're watching really closely. And as we all said, oversight isn't always the sexiest of issues, but I think it's really, really important. And the COVID shows us exactly why. First of all, because it is a life and death situation, literally. There are Americans who are dying here, and oversight is so valuable in this context because it helps people understand what their government is doing and whether their government is working for them, or if the government is giving recommendations that are to be trusted. These are all so important. I mean, we just saw yesterday that the president giving health advice in the briefing that it is beyond irresponsible and really, really problematic. And I think it's times like these that Americans really need to make sure they can trust their government. And right now, they're not really able to do so. And there's a lot of different aspects of this COVID response that we're looking into, whether it's the lack of testing, whether it's a lack of candor in the number of Americans that were affected by COVID, whether it's the president trying to keep the numbers down so that it didn't look bad for him, the directives that are given to agencies, the directives that are given to the states, whether or not the federal government is prioritizing states that Trump likes over states that Trump doesn't. And we've seen this in the context of New York, where New York was not able to get some of the resources it requested, where other states like Florida that Trump has a good relationship with those governors were. And so I think over and over and again, we're seeing how important it is to have a government that is candid and telling the American people the truth. And right now, if you can't trust your government, that's creating huge problems. And I will say on top of that, that one of the really interesting aspects of the COVID issue is that it brings all of Donald Trump's various issues we've had in the last 3 years and rolls it all into one. For example, the lack of testing is all about him not wanting to look bad politically, and saying that the COVID is not going to be any big deal, that people aren't, it's not going to really hit America as hard, is again him trying to look good politically. Sending supplies to friendly states is him building up, allies and trying to knock down those that dissent against him. The same with firing Brick and threatening to fire Dr. Fauci. These are all issues where he's demanding loyalty. And so I think that over and over again, what we're seeing in this is some of the same issues that we've seen throughout the last 3 years, just playing all out in one crisis.
Wow. And Elizabeth, I want to ask you, yesterday, Speaker Nancy Pelosi, she was asked about whether the new House Select Committee that was stood up to look into the crisis would be looking into how Trump initially handled the response. And her response was curious. She said, and I quote, "That's an after-action review." And she went on to indicate that the committee's focus would be on how relief money would be spent going forward. So she seemed to really be saying, we're not going to look back at what happened, we're only going to look forward. But let me ask you, if Congress doesn't look now into what went wrong with this administration's response, aren't we at risk that the same failures that led us into this situation will happen again?
Yeah, look, I think it's hard to actually have such a fine line between what's happened in the past, what's happening now, because it's all rolled into one. The failures in getting the testing ready, the continued failures in providing necessary equipment to all who need it. As Molly said, why are some getting it and others not? So I think you can't really draw that bright line between the mismanagement that we saw from the Trump administration at the beginning, which, was not that long ago. We're not talking about something that happened 2 years ago. We're talking about 3 months ago, and those issues are still those failures are still being felt today. And I think a good model, and my colleagues at the Constitutional Accountability Center wrote a great piece on this. A good model is to look at the Truman Commission, which then Senator Truman headed up during World War II, that looked at not just kind of the things that everyone agrees we should be looking at, fraud and contracting, price gouging, things like that, but also looked at corruption. It looked at the way that the government might be mishandling certain aspects of the war effort. And it made sure that we safeguarded both American lives and American taxpayer dollars. And I think that sort of model that we've seen from history is something that congressional oversight commissions can learn from today.
And I'm glad you mentioned congressional oversight commissions, and I want to talk to you about that, Noah. So, the CARES Act, this massive relief bill that was passed quickly to address the crisis. And we just saw this week another COVID relief bill that Congress sent out to try to get aid for small businesses and hospitals. So a lot of money is going out very quickly. What are the challenges to ensuring that there's effective oversight in this environment?
I think there are a couple of challenges. One of them is what you just referred to, which is that so much money is going out so fast that if things go the way they normally do in Washington, which is that it takes several months for bodies to get up and running and to get staffed and to start collecting documents, sort of the damage is going to be done already. And it is, while we do need to look back and see what went wrong, I totally agree with that point. In some ways, oversight is most effective when it can stop the bad things from happening. And so it's going to be really, really important to get these apparatuses up and running very quickly. I think the other really significant challenge is that the president has made clear all along that he is not interested in oversight and is not looking to cooperate with it. So in a lot of ways, we were heartened when the CARES Act passed that it had some key oversight provisions. It had a conflicts of interest provision that, at least for the bailout, the corporate bailout portion of it, the president's company and companies of relatives of his and companies affiliated with members of Congress couldn't get that aid, and it set up several different layers of oversight. What we've seen since then are, unfortunately, all of the ways in which that may be insufficient. There are large parts of the CARES Act that the president's company and members of Congress and others who clearly have conflicts of interest can, and it's becoming more apparent, will try to benefit from. There are, the president, as I mentioned earlier, announced his intention to appoint a loyalist from the White House counsel's office into one of the key new inspector general positions. He removed Glenn Fine, who was the acting inspector general at the Department of Defense, who is a widely respected, longtime government watchdog. He was removed from that acting position, which effectively removed him from another major oversight position over the CARES Act. So the president is kind of signaling that he's going to do everything he can. He's going to do it in broad daylight to undercut the ability to look closely at who's getting this money and why. I think Congress has shown that they're not going to take this sitting down, lying down.
If I can ask you about that, Noah, so you highlighted some of the challenges that Trump has been doing to sort of undercut oversight, with that COVID-19 funds. But, if you were advising Congress on how best to ensure that there was really meaningful oversight against a president who seems to do everything in his power to avoid it and will stop at nothing to do it, from firing inspector generals, what would you advise Congress do to make sure that this is meaningful, effective, and that we don't have a replay of what happened with impeachment?
I mean, I think the first thing to do is to be screaming from the rooftops about it. That I think what the president is banking on is that everybody is understandably preoccupied with the fact that, there's this terrible disease that could kill a lot of people and is taking people's jobs. And therefore, nobody's going to notice if he eliminates the oversight and if he and those who give to his campaign and bring business to him are skimming millions off the top. And the way to counteract that is you show that we are noticing, and that is for a long time there was one member of this congressional oversight panel that was created under the CARES Act. And that one member was out there writing op-eds and going on TV and doing everything he could possibly do to say, hey, pay attention, people. Certainly Elizabeth and Molly and I and the many out there like us have been doing the same. There was a story that there was going to be a mass firing of inspectors general. That was something that got a little bit of reporting. That hasn't happened yet. And I hope it won't happen. And I think one of the reasons it hasn't happened yet is because people muscled this story into the news at a time when it was hard to do. And so I think that's what, Nancy Pelosi setting up this new commission is a step in that direction, is just be loud and persistent and don't let the president shut it down.
I think that, I think that that's a really important point because, I think a lot of times, particularly when we are in moments of tragedy and crisis, there is a tendency from some politicians, not Trump, because he will politicize anything, but the idea that, we focus on only the most immediate crisis that affects all of us, that is the common point. And this would be, obviously the health concerns. And those absolutely we need to focus on, and we need to ensure that we are supporting our healthcare workers, our essential workers in all forms. But we still need to raise our voices about everything else going on, because the time is now. These things are life and death beyond just, are there enough testing equipment available? Now is the time to raise our voices about why this is affecting the Black community more than any other, because of systemic racism, because of systemic disparities that hit that community harder. Now is the time to talk about what Trump is doing with respect to potentially acting in his own interests, own financial interests, instead of the best interests of the people who live in this country. You know, these are the times to raise our voices about these issues. These are the times to say we are watching. As Noah said, it can have an effect, this pressure. You know, we can walk and chew gum. We are all worried. We're worried about our families. We're worried about, you know, what is going to happen. And there's an understandable anxiety, but it's our job to take care of each other, to take care of our communities, to take care of our neighbors. And, you know, that includes making sure that we are speaking up, especially when there are vulnerable communities. I'm thinking, you know, undocumented workers who don't have as much of a political influence as others of us might. And ultimately, that's where congressional oversight comes in, because Congress has not only this constitutional obligation, but this gift to be able to say, we have the authority to look at allocated funds and make sure they're being spent appropriately. We have the power under the Constitution to enforce the voting rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. And so across these issues, it is really Congress's duty to conduct that effective oversight. And how they can do it effectively is something we can talk about later, because I know that I want to make sure we talk about the court cases about this. But, you know, now is the time to raise our voices and to make sure that our leaders in government are using their duly given roles under the Constitution to make sure that their voices are being heard.
And I just want to flag that this has already worked in terms of Dr. Fauci specifically, which we know that Trump has disagreements with. Fauci has gone against Trump's wishes in a couple of things. But the public trusts Dr. Fauci. And I think because of that, his job is safe, because the administration knows that if they fire him right now, there's going to be a massive outcry. And so that's just one example of how the public paying attention to this really does hold the administration accountable in a strong way.
That's great. So I do want to switch gears. You know, Elizabeth, you mentioned there are, you know, some other oversight issues that are really important. So I want to talk about an important oversight case that is pending in the DC Appellate Court. And that's the one involving the president's former White House counsel, Don McGahn. Can you tell us what's that case about? And frankly, why is that so important on the issue of oversight?
Yeah, so if you think back to the Mueller report days, and one of the topics of investigation was the Trump administration and Trump himself obstructing justice. And the House committee that was looking into these things wanted to ask Don McGahn, former White House counsel, some questions, particularly about the idea that Trump wanted him to fire Bob Mueller to stop the report. President Trump instructed Don McGahn that he should assert this idea of absolute immunity and not respond to the congressional subpoena asking for information. The parties went to court. They got a great ruling from the district court judge saying that no, Congress has had this constitutional duty to inquire and investigate, and with that comes subpoena power since, frankly, the beginning of our country. And then in a rather remarkable ruling, three-judge panel with some Trump-appointed judges said that the House couldn't even get into court to enforce the subpoena, didn't have standing in court to seek to have the court enforce its subpoenas. Fortunately, that two-judge ruling has been vacated by the en banc DC Circuit Court, which means all of the judges, and the case will be re-argued telephonically, because of course that's where we are now, next week. But this is a really important case, and it's not really even about obstruction of justice by the Trump administration and the Russia report and all that. It's about the House being able to conduct effective oversight. Because think about it, the House, in many ways, and the COVID-19 crisis is a perfect example, investigates sensitive matters. People aren't going to voluntarily give up financial information, information about criminal activities, information about corruption, bribes, all of this. And so using a subpoena to get witnesses and information and documents is usually the only way that the House can actually get this information that it needs. And this is true both in sensitive contexts like the Mueller report and impeachment, in life and death situations like public health, and just in general situations like, ensuring that taxpayer dollars are spent well. And so if the House can't enforce its subpoenas, then it is almost impossible for it to do effective oversight. All of the great provisions that Noah talked about earlier in the CARES Act, if the House can't actually put muscle behind its request for information, then we're in really big trouble. So everyone should be watching, or I guess listening to, the DC Circuit argument next week in the McGahn case to see how that goes.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit, I think what we have in the past seen in both Democratic and Republican administrations is that there's been sort of a negotiation between the executive branch and congressional oversight bodies, where the executive says, we're not going to give you everything you want, but we'll give you these things. And Congress says, well, we want a bit more than that. And they kind of work out a deal. And I think always both sides are a bit frustrated with how it plays out, but there's always been that back and forth. This administration has broken new ground, and it's really unfortunate new ground, in saying we're not giving anything, period. And that's why these issues have occasionally gone to the courts in the past, but now it's all about the courts, because that give and take between the executive and legislative branches is just not happening. The president's just not participating, and so suddenly these court cases are of vast importance.
Well, so is there anything that we, the public, the outside, can do to help change that dynamic? Given that I think Elizabeth brought up a good point. There were Trump appointees that were put on the DC Appellate Court. It's hard for the public not to possibly see a connection that, lo and behold, they seem to be ruling in Trump's favor on an important issue. It sort of breeds this kind of helplessness. Is there, what else can public do to help ensure that, as courts are looking at these important issues, that it's done with the lens that's keeping in mind the public and not the executive branch?
Vote. I mean, sounds flippant, but really, I mean, that's kind of what we're seeing here is, Trump won the election and Trump gets to set the judges right now. And the most powerful thing that any single American can do right now to fix this is to vote in November and to make sure that they're putting someone in office who shares their values and protect their interests.
I guess I'd also add, kind of, again, make your voices heard, is that I think there was a feeling among members of Congress that sort of, we tried oversight, we impeached the president, and it didn't work. And so maybe we need to sort of go back home with our tails between our legs and, see if we can legislate and do other kinds of things. And I think that, one thing that the public can do is let Congress know that actually, we appreciate accountability and oversight, and we're not going to punish Congress for doing that. We're going to punish Congress for not doing that. That is Congress. I think that there are a lot of people in Congress who do really care about oversight, who do really care about stopping corruption, but they need bucking up, and that's our job.
Absolutely. I think that's, as Molly said, the ultimate thing you can do is to vote, because who is in the White House and who is in the Senate determine who is going to be on the bench deciding these crucial cases. And of course, they don't just relate to oversight. If you look at this year's Supreme Court term, they relate to LGBTQ rights, abortion rights, voting rights, criminal justice, you name it, it's before these judges. And so voting, absolutely. And also, I love the name of this webinar that we're doing, will be the oversight, because we the people are the ultimate oversight. And, I live in Washington, D.C., so I don't have real elected leaders for me in Washington, but for those of you who do, they care what you think. And I know it might seem like they don't, like DC is far away, but Noah's exactly right. Like, buck up your elected officials if they care about these issues, and if they aren't giving them, the priority that they should, then let them know that you don't like that. And yes, money talks in our electoral system, unfortunately, and that could be a whole other hour. But your voice does matter, and I think that so often we get discouraged about that and think that DC is this own thing. But you can make your voice heard, and with enough pressure, if we all get together, then we can be the oversight.
Molly, I want to ask you. I think President Trump seemed to set a tone about transparency and oversight when, from the very beginning, unlike every other president since Nixon, he refused to produce his tax returns, and he's persisted today. But yet, I got to be frank, this issue doesn't seem to be one that concerns most Americans, that the president of the United States has not produced his tax return, unlike every other president since Nixon. Can you tell us why that's an issue that the American people should care more passionately about?
It goes back to what I was saying before in terms of understanding who your government is working for. And I think that's why we have ethics laws in our government. That's why we have laws that say, if you're a member of Congress, you can't also work for Texaco. We don't let people own certain stocks. We don't let people work at 2 times for certain companies while they're in the government. And I think we have a lot of ethics laws so that we can protect the interests of the American people. And so the idea is that you want to make sure that that person is entirely making decisions based on the best interests of Americans and not the best interests of their own wallet. And that's why Americans should really care about the tax returns. Obviously, I don't know what's in those tax returns, and I don't know what we'd really learn from them. But I do think it's really, really important that whoever is sitting in that White House, that I have full confidence that that person is not going to be making a decision because it's going to make them a couple extra $1 million. And if that is the case, we need to know it. And if we were able to see the tax returns, even if that person were to still make a decision that would benefit themselves, at least we would know it and have an understanding of what that decision was. For example, the Republican tax plan that was passed in 2017, I suspect probably was quite good for President Trump. And I think it would be important for people to understand when laws like that are passed, how someone is benefiting. And so I think that is one of the most valuable things we have, is this transparency to show who our elected officials are working for, what their interests are, and where they may be making money based on their political acts. And I think that's really the crux of it.
That's great. For our audience that's tuning in, I just want a reminder, you can type your questions on the chat on the right side of your YouTube screen. So, please, we welcome. We've got some, oversight superstars here. So looking forward to some great questions. Want to shift gears and talk about voting rights and oversight. And I'll start with you, Elizabeth. The April 7th Wisconsin primary, got to be frank, it was an ugly preview of how the president and some Republicans may use this pandemic to force voters to choose between exercising their right to vote or their health. What should we be doing now to ensure that if the country is facing another pandemic as we get closer to the November election, we don't have a repeat of what we saw in Wisconsin?
Yeah. So first, God bless those voters who went out, even in the midst of all of this, and cast their votes. But they absolutely should not, as you said, be put to that choice. It shouldn't be your vote or your life. And, that is just a travesty. First, I just want to say that, we can do this. If you look in our history, we have had national elections during the Civil War. We had a presidential election during the Civil War. We've had elections during world wars. We've had elections when Washington was burning because the British attacked in, the War of 1812. during the 1918 flu pandemic, we had an election. And so we absolutely cannot allow this narrative to start that there's somehow a justification for delaying or in any way infringing upon what will happen in November, and that is to have this national election. I think that there have been a lot of good ideas coming from some states, like we saw in New York, the governor saying that there could be, statewide mail-in voting. It's important to have no excuse absentee ballots, getting folks the help they need if they need to go in and actually cast their ballot in person. So, ensuring that we maintain social distancing, have the public health guidelines be respected. But this is something we absolutely can do. And it's something that I am deeply, deeply concerned about, because we've already been seeing massive voter suppression, even without the aid of a pandemic. And so, the idea that in states where we've seen voters being purged off the rolls, DMVs and being closed, even in states where there are strict voter ID requirements, polling places being closed, that was already happening. And, we at Constitutional Accountability Center have been kind of thinking of a lot of these issues as things were already bad and COVID is making them worse. And the situation with voting, it definitely falls into that category. So I think, pushing members of Congress to focus on this, because they do have the constitutional power to secure the right to vote. Getting your states involved, again, if you live in a state, getting those states involved to ensure that they have things ready for election day. Of course, if you have a hostile state government, that becomes even harder. But we need to keep our eye on the ball for the November election, and we absolutely can do this, and we must do it. And don't let that narrative start.
I'm just going to jump in. I will say that this is the second time in 4 years that this alarm bell has rung. In 2016, we suddenly realized how not secure our electoral system was when we had electoral interference by a foreign power. And now we're seeing, we're really understanding more than we ever have before how difficult it is for people to vote. And we're seeing now the disparity that we're facing. There are some states that are going to be just fine. I'm from Oregon, which is a vote by mail state. And so, that will go off pretty smoothly. But there's so many states that have really tried to suppress the vote for so long that don't have multiple days that people can vote on, and early voting, and we're seeing the importance of that. And so I feel like looking at this in connection with 2016, it really is a massive call to arms that our entire voting system is not working for the American people and really needs to be revamped.
And if there's at least one revampment that you think would be important, Molly, for us to make that we could do between now and November, what would that be that would make the biggest difference?
Setting COVID aside broadly, because that probably requires some very specific thinking. I think really just lengthening the amount of time that people can vote, so that people that may work at an hourly job where they're not able to leave on election day still have the opportunity to vote. So I think that expanding early voting so that people can get to the polling place when it is available and convenient for them outside of their jobs and their childcare responsibilities and things like that is going to go a really long way. And it also helps in the COVID context, because it means that not everyone is showing up at the polling place at the same time. And we've seen that is one that we can really manage right now is, as we're social distancing, the entire point is so that when we all go to the grocery store, we're not there at the same time. And we can do the exact same thing with our polling places.
Gotcha. Noah, I want to ask you, earlier this week, the Senate Intelligence Committee released a bipartisan report that unanimously found that the intelligence community's assessment that Russia interfered in our election was not only sound, but it was untainted by politics. So we've got a bipartisan report that once again found that Russia interfered in our election and that the intelligence community's findings wasn't political. But despite these findings, the Trump administration still hasn't made election security one of its top priorities. If the head of the executive branch won't take the lead in protecting our nation against foreign interference, in our elections? What can we do to ensure that our leaders are doing everything they can to make sure we don't have a repeat of 2016?
Well, I mean, if the president's not going to do it, Congress can play a big role in making that happen. I think that we have not had a lot of profiles in courage in the last 3 years of members of Congress and others taking courageous positions when it was politically difficult for them to do so. I think this report was at least a small step in that direction. I mean, essentially, it was merely acknowledging facts that everybody who's interested in facts already knew, and so you can. But we live in a day and age where facts, just simply restating facts can be courageous because we have a president who sees the recitation of facts that are unfavorable to him as a betrayal. I think Congress can go further, needs to go further, and say, knowing that there was this attack on our election and that there's no serious disagreement about it. It's the consensus view of the intelligence community. It's the view of a bipartisan group of senators. It's the view of half of the House or a little bit more. It is, but should be a unanimous view there too, that Congress needs to give to states and the federal government the resources that they need to protect the election. The CARES Act included, I believe it was $400 million for election security. It needs to be a whole lot more, but that was more than there was in the original draft. A lot of folks, I think, kind of everybody on the screen here today, pushed for more and is pushing for a whole lot more still. Congress passes legislation. Congress can allocate resources. They need to do that. If the president is going to, veto billions or trillions of dollars in aid that people desperately need because he does not want election security, that would be, I think that would be a powerful statement in and of itself that people would have to grapple with. But so I think it is Congress controls the purse. They should use that power to do something about this.
That's great. So let's talk a bit about the president and his properties that he doesn't want to let go. Elizabeth, your organization, the Constitutional Accountability Center, along with Crew as well, famously filed lawsuits against this president for failing to comply with the Constitution's Foreign Emoluments Clause. What is the Foreign Emoluments Clause, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so the Foreign Emoluments Clause, was a crucial protection against corruption that the drafters of our Constitution put in. It might seem sort of abstract to us, and probably before President Trump, a lot of people probably didn't know about the Foreign Emoluments Clause, but it was incredibly important to the founders of this country and to the folks who wrote the Constitution. And it says that federal officials cannot get gifts, foreign profits from governments or foreign state actors. And if they want to get, with respect to foreign emoluments, if they want to receive and keep those foreign benefits, then they have to get consent of Congress first. And so we represent members of Congress who have come into court to say that the president has been receiving and keeping foreign benefits, both through actual payments by foreign governments at his hotel, leasing properties abroad and here in the United States, getting valuable things like trademarks from the Chinese government, and on and on and on and on. We don't even know the full extent of the foreign emoluments that he has been accepting. And he has never once, even when Republicans controlled both houses of Congress, he's never once put them before Congress and said, I'd like to keep these foreign profits, may I do so? And that's the way that it's worked throughout history, really without any controversy. We've had this happen since the beginning of our country, for both foreign benefits, normal like payments that go to everyday working members of our federal government, to presidents getting gifts like elephants and sabers from foreign governments as gift. And they've all come before Congress and said, I'd like to keep this if they want to keep it, or they simply don't accept the foreign benefit, which has frequently happened in more recent times. But President Trump has not abided by that. And so we have had to go into court to try to force him to do so. We're still fighting that battle in the courts. And I know that Noah and his group are as well. And so, the fight still goes on. But this isn't the emoluments clauses are just another form of constitutional oversight and corruption prevention measures that President Trump has thumbed his nose at. And he has this sort of shell game of opposing any sort of oversight. So, for example, in our suit, he said, oh, we shouldn't have the members of Congress in court trying to enforce the emoluments clause. They can do so through congressional investigations and getting information that way. And then in other lawsuits, his lawyers get up there and say, oh no, you can't use congressional investigations and subpoenas to get information about foreign emoluments. And it's the same thing on and on and on. He'll try to push things, and at every turn, he avoids oversight. There is never a moment when he says, okay, you're right, this is part of the Constitution, this is part of our constitutional norms, this is a part of provisions put forth into law, where he actually accepts oversight in the way that presidents have. Even, think about President Nixon. He probably did not want to give up all that information that he had to give up that led to him resigning, but he did it at a certain point. But this president does not. And, so the emoluments clause is really important to getting back to things that Molly has been saying this whole time in this conversation and beyond, that, you want to know that your president and your leaders in general are acting in your best interest and not to line their own pockets or the pockets of their family members. And the sad thing is, even in this life or death situation, we don't have that confidence from President Trump and his administration. And that's, heartbreaking to me as someone who cares about government and the Constitution. And it's not something that we should have to do in this public health crisis or, whenever the president acts on the world stage.
I'll just make a quick plug for the domestic emoluments clause as well, which is, President Trump also hasn't disclosed to the American public how much the U.S. government is paying his properties. We know that they are staying at his properties. The Secret Service stays at Mar-a-Lago when he goes to Mar-a-Lago. We know that the military has stayed at his resort in Scotland. And we know that there is government money that is being, your tax dollar money that is being paid to President Trump, and we don't even know the extent of those payments yet. And that's just another issue of, it would be really, again, if we had the number, you could make your own decision as to whether or not you thought that was proper, but I think we at least need to have the number so the American people can make their own decision as to whether or not they want to spend their money in that way.
And just to, just to build on both of those points, I think the emoluments clause is a really good example of how, we're not talking about abstract hypotheticals of corruption. We're talking about real things that are happening in the world. So, the domestic emoluments clause, which is a part of the two emoluments lawsuits that the crew is involved in, we just saw in the past few days that the president's company is asking the federal government to give it a break on its lease payments for the federal property that has become the Trump International Hotel in Washington. Well, that's a domestic emolument, but it's also an occasion for the president to use his position to get money for his companies. Similarly, all three of the cases deal with the foreign emoluments foreign emoluments clause. We've seen reporting in the last couple of days that the United States government, not the United States government, although it's hard to tell the difference sometimes, but the Trump organization is asking for assistance for its properties in the UK and Ireland and other. And what what favors are foreign governments going to be tempted to ask for in exchange for helping the president's businesses? And that's, and particularly in these times when Americans, are desperately fighting for their livelihoods and sometimes their lives, those are not questions we should need to be asking.
That's great. So we've got some questions coming in. So one of the first questions one of our audience members has is, what can be done about election security? You talked a little bit about that, but if you can tell us, what are the things when we look at election security, what can be done? And I'll put that out to you, Molly.
I'll jump in first. Number one is just enforcing some of the laws that we have. Right now, our Federal Election Commission is not enforcing our election laws. And so making sure that, for example, foreign donors aren't able to donate to elections is really important. Another big piece of it is a backup trail, a paper trail. And regardless of if you want to do paper ballots, or some jurisdictions do printouts of ballots that you're using on computers and things like that. But I think we have to make sure that there is a verifiable paper trail to understand exactly how people voted and make sure that those votes are getting counted properly.
Great.
I would just add that, there have been, especially talking about foreign interference in elections, thinking about election security in that respect, there has been a bill that Mitch McConnell has refused to put forward that would go a long way toward making our elections more secure. And he, for whatever reasons, has not been eager to put that to a vote. So I think, pushing for a vote on the legislation that already has been put out to try to make our elections more secure. And since we're talking about Beth Wright, I just she made another comment. She's totally right that Eleanor Holmes Norton is a real elected official. You're right. I'm just bitter about the denigration of DC. It's sometimes it just really gets to me. But you're right, and it's a shame that she cannot vote on the House floor. She should be able to, but she hustles for DC surely as much as she can.
Yes, big shout out to Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Absolutely.
All right, our next question. The relationship between president and Congress evolves. It isn't the same as 20, 50, 200 years ago. Question, is Trump's conduct an aberration or just a step in the natural evolution of the relationship between the branches?
So I'm happy to jump in on this one.
Yeah.
It will be a step in the natural evolution of the relationship between the branches if we don't stop it from being so. I think one of the things that I say whenever I'm out there sort of talking about the work that Crew is doing and groups like American Oversight and Constitutional Accountability Center is that that there are other officials out there, other people who may be running for office, potentially in both parties, who are paying very close attention to what this president is getting away with. And if and when we are lucky enough to come out on the other end of this corrupt administration, we could well be facing future leaders who are going to try to do all of the same things that this president did, whether it is with regard to enriching themselves and maintaining their own financial interests, or whether it's in regard to using their own power without the checks and balances from Congress and the courts. And so it is only if Congress steps up and actually creates consequences for this action, if the courts step up and litigators step up and create consequences for these actions, if the public steps up through having their voices heard and voting and calling their members of Congress and creating consequences for the president usurping power, that we're not going to continue moving in that direction. I don't think this was ever natural. I mean, there had been presidential power grabs in the past, but this is of a whole different order. And I'm very hopeful that we will go back to something that looks like where we were before. But we're not going to be able to do that if everybody, lets this president and this administration get away with it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. There have always been these, attempts to increase your own power. And, I think the example that Noah gave about, the ways that we've negotiated subpoenas and requests for information before, there have always been these push and pull, dynamics between the president and Congress. What is unique here is this just kind of denial of the game rules. And, I'm not a political strategist. I'm a constitutional lawyer. And, that I think is incredibly troubling because, without the courts enforcing the constitutional requirements for our government, there aren't consequences. Without the ultimate consequence of impeachment having ultimately gone to conviction, that kind of ultimate game rule setting part of the Constitution, there aren't consequences. Although I will say, I don't know what the political benefits were one way or the other, and I'll let other people decide that. But the fact that the House did impeach Donald Trump, I think is a real thing. It's a thing. And it was a consequence, even if it didn't result in him being removed from office. So I don't think this is a natural evolution. I think this is literally an existential kind of question for the continuing of our constitutional democracy.
But I think it really amplifies the responsibility that's going to sit on the head of the next president, whether that person is in the next 6 months or 4 years from now. The next president is going to have to make the choice as to whether he's going to play by Donald Trump's rules or go back to rules where the White House is a co-equal branch with the other branches of government and plays along by the rules that we all grew up with. And so I think that's going to be really interesting to watch and see if we can get someone with a great deal of integrity and personal fortitude to be able to make that decision.
Wow. So we are nearing the end of today's show. Time always seems to fly by. We always want to end on a hopeful note. So if I can just ask each of our great guests just 1 minute, what is something between now and the election that people can do that would be most effective in holding this administration accountable? One thing, minute or less, each of you. We'll start with you, Noah.
Again, I would say, kind of make your voice heard, call your members of Congress, write to your local newspapers, that when people push back, we do get results. As Molly pointed out, Dr. Fauci is still in place, despite the president maybe not wanting him there. As we talked about, there haven't been more Inspector General firings. Just yesterday, the Federal Reserve announced that it was going to be transparent about who it's giving these trillions of dollars to. And that's because people, organizations like ours, members of Congress, but also the public pushed for it. So, as freaked out as all of us may be about the coronavirus, don't forget about these issues of democracy and oversight. Make your voice heard, and it's going to make a difference.
Gotcha. Now go to you, Molly, and then Elizabeth.
I'm going to go back to what I said before, which is vote. You got to get there and vote. And I know it's going to be hard this year and we don't know what it's going to look like, but it's more important than it ever has been. And between now and then, if you could make sure your friends and families and neighbors are registered and that they know how to vote in our new Corona adjusted times, that's going to be even more important. So I think that's really where my focus is really focus on making sure that at the end of the day, we have elected officials that we can trust, that do want to be transparent and do the right thing for the American people.
Thank you. And Elizabeth.
Yes, well, absolutely, it's vote. But one other thing I would say is to keep an eye on the courts. We have a unique opportunity coming up in May. The court, because of the COVID-19 situation, is going to be doing telephonic argument in some of the biggest cases, including a case about the House's ability to subpoena Trump's tax and other financial records. So look on the Supreme Court's website to find out when those arguments are. You'll be able to listen to the audio live for the first time. So do that. Pay attention to what's happening in the courts as well, and let them know, hey, we're watching you.
That's right. Well, thank you. I want to thank our guests. You've given some amazing insight. I want to thank you for sharing your expertise. Keep doing the great work that you're doing. I know that this episode will be available on our YouTube page. And stay tuned, folks, for the month of May. We have some great events coming up. Thank you again to our guests. We appreciate you and keep doing the great work.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.